Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another class for Epidemics of Injustice. We're just going to wait for a moment while we let everyone get in, but please just take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and your pronouns. Please complete the check-in in the chat or on the screen if you haven't done so already. As always, during the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and we will be collecting those throughout the presentation. And there will be some time for questions at the end. These are just your Zoom participant controls. You will be muted, so you cannot unmute yourself, but feel free, like I said, to put things in the chat. And at the end, you will be able to be unmuted. As always, we are your instructors this evening, and we are so happy for you all to be here. For those who may be new, this is an annual course that's offered or that's sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice with the goal of preparing public health leaders and community members and giving them tools to bring about social change and address social determinants of health. These are just our community guidelines that we like to say at the beginning of every single class period. So just please remember to listen with an open mind, have mutual respect and appreciation for one another, let everyone participate, and disruptive and disrespectful language will not be tolerated and will result in removal from the class session. Today's lecture, like many of our lectures, may contain material that might be difficult to discuss. So if you need to, please feel free to step away and take care of yourself during the presentation. As a reminder, the University of Illinois at Chicago stands on the original homelands of the Miami through Fires people, the Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi, who have been stewards of this land for generations. Illinois is also home to a diverse Native community of more than 75,000 tribal members, many of whom live in the Chicago area. And for those who are not currently residing in Chicago, we encourage you to look into the Indigenous people of your own lands. So we are lucky enough to have a panel today. So we have 3 different speakers. So kind of the structure of it is we'll introduce our presenter, they'll do a short presentation, and then we'll go on like that. And then we'll have some time for some panel questions. So first up, we have Yesenia Chavez, who was born and raised on the southeast side of Chicago. She's a 3rd generation 10th Ward resident. As a pre-med student, she is currently pursuing her interest in public health and neuroscience. In 2021, as a Michael Reese Foundation Scholar with the mentorship and the Medical Organization for Latino Advancement, she completed research studying the impact of air pollution on mental health outcomes of Chicago Latinx children. She is the co-chair of the Community Wellness Committee for United Neighbors of the 10th Ward and a community organizer with the Southeast Environmental Task Force. Yesenia advocates for environmental justice, health equity, and enjoys connecting with high school students to teach them how pollution can affect human health. Her recent experience as an organizer and Chicago hunger striker for the Stop General Iron campaign, a movement ignited by environmental racism, identified the need for data to support advocacy efforts towards equitable and sustainable reform. Ultimately, this experience was pivotal in leading Yesenia towards her current endeavors as a student and a member of her community. So Yesenia, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Beautiful. So I have a couple slides that are quite dense with information, so I might run through a few of them quite rapidly, but I can always share this presentation as well afterwards if anybody wants to review some of the information. So my presentation is on environmental racism and what is the impact. This is my bio page, so I got a great introduction, so we're gonna skip this. I think my only takeaway for this one is that I'm the oldest daughter of Mexican immigrants, and I'm also a dog mom to 3 beautiful pit bulls. So we're gonna start off with a couple definitions. We're gonna talk about air pollution, particulate matter, and what is environmental racism, just so everybody has a better idea and concept of what those things are. So air pollution can be defined as something that occurs in the air when it's contaminated with either biological or human-made agents. So you have primary and secondary components. Primary mostly comes from cars or industry, and then your secondary components are going to come as reactions that happen in the air resulting from your primary sources of pollution. In the General Iron Campaign, we focused a lot on particulate matter because that is very closely related to some of the compounds that would be released from things like auto fluff and heavy industry. So some of the things that we learned was that particulate matter is a complex mix of liquid droplets that come from like motor vehicles or industry, as previously mentioned. So some of the things that you can see in particulate matter mixes are sulfates, nitrates, ammonia. They usually come categorized in 3 different sizes. Going from largest to smallest, you have PM10, which can also be called coarse particles. You also have PM2.5, which are usually referred to as fine particulate matter, which is the one that we also mostly focus on in the General Iron Campaign. Then you have PM0.1 or ultrafine particles as well. So according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, the pollution particle size is directly linked to the harm that it can cause or potentially cause to human health. So basically, the smaller the particle, the more dangerous it is for human health. And additional to that, we learned that there is no safe level of exposure to particulate matter. So in this slide, you'll see a couple of different images. On the left, you're going to see just an image on different types of pollutants, where they come from. So you have vehicles, you have natural pollutants that are here, you have airplanes, and then you have things like barges as well. So you have your primary pollutants that are released into the atmosphere. And then over to the right-hand side of this image, you'll see the secondary pollutants. On the bottom left, you'll see a comparison of particulate matter sizes compared to a human hair size. So human hairs are typically like 50 to 70 microns in diameter versus particulate matter. As previously mentioned, PM10 is going to be this blue circle here. Fine particulate matter, which is 2.5, is going to be maybe like this orange, like sunrise kind of color. And then 0.1 particulate matter is even smaller than that. You can see about 7 or 8 of them fit across a PM 2.5 particle. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of different things listed on the scale. So PM10, you can think of things like pollen, mold, and then the smaller they get, the closer to the left they'll get to the scale. So bacteria, cat allergens, and viruses. So something like COVID-19 would be ultrafine particles or PM or under PM.1. And then you have gaseous contaminants, so things like nitrous oxide, sulfur trioxide would be considered the smallest, and those also do come from heavy industry and volatile organic compounds. So huge question, how does particulate matter get into the body? There's a couple of different routes that particulate matter takes in order to affect our different organ systems. The first, and I think the most obvious, is mechanical inhalation. So just breathing it in, essentially going through our nasal pathways. And then from there, it has access to a couple of different systems. So you have the olfactory bulb that has direct access to the brain. So bypassing the blood-brain barrier, that would be transported through the olfactory bulb. And then you have the nasal epithelial transmission. So what that means is that once you inhale these particles, the smaller that they are, our tissues can actually absorb them. And basically, once they get into our bloodstream, it's free game for any of our organ systems. So what is environmental racism? So environmental racism is a form of systemic racism where essentially communities that are less affluent, usually they're not predominantly white, they're disproportionately burdened with health hazards through discriminatory policies and practices that basically force them to live in close proximity to different sources of toxic waste. So some of those sources, as previously mentioned, can be things like mines, landfills, power stations, major roads, industrial operations, or sewage operations as well. So resulting from the close proximity to these toxicants, a lot of times what you'll see as well is greater rates of chronic diseases in these communities as well. So what does that look like in Chicago? On the left, you're going to see a map that represents the, as of 2015 and 2019, this map is from the Chicago Health Atlas. So you'll see the Hispanic or Latino population in Chicago. So the darker the blue is where the population is more heavily concentrated. So you see this heavily concentrated on the northwest side and the southeast side of the city versus on the right-hand side where it's non-Hispanic white population, same time range. And you'll see a lot of that concentration on the north side, mostly northeast side. And then you'll see some in the 10th ward as well. So this next slide is representative of the hardship index. So what this measures is basically, it gives a score regarding the hardship that a community would face based on a couple different indicators. So things like unemployment, age dependency, education, per capita income, crowded housing, and poverty. So basically the higher the score or the darker the blue represents that these communities would essentially face more of a hardship versus the ones that are lighter. And as you can see on the map, the lighter ones are usually concentrated, not usually, they are concentrated on the northeast side of the city. This map here is one of the most helpful tools that I found during the Stop Gender Iron campaign. So this is a cumulative burden impact map of environmental exposures. So basically the warmer colors like red and orange are going to represent communities that face higher burden from environmental burdens. And then some of the things that you see indicated on the map are industrial corridors. So you'll see them heavily concentrated as well, basically right at the epicenter of a lot of these communities that are highlighted in red and higher orange color. And then the blue color basically represents the communities with the lowest burden. So my community where I currently live in, was born and raised in, is down here in the 10th ward. Basically, we're surrounded by industrial corridors. Somewhere like Lincoln Park, which is where General Iron came from, they're located right over here. I'm going to fly through this one. I know it's a bit dense with information, but a couple of things about air pollution and particulate matter, who's most at risk. So elderly children, residents, what underlying chronic diseases, anybody that's living in close proximity to traffic, things that we've mentioned previously. Some studies have also associated air pollution with things like ADHD, autism, and cognitive and neurological decline. So some things that I have read myself is that the gray matter within our brain tissue is actually, speaking in a long term, has been affected by air pollution, which you can see by different rates of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease in residents in communities that are heavily burdened by environmental exposure. So why was General Iron such a big deal in our community? A couple different things. So I think the main one was that they were kicked out of the north side after residents complained of the burden that they were causing their neighborhood, essentially. And what happened was that RMG bought the assets from the Lapcom family and basically wanted to relocate those same operations, the same employers. So there was no opportunity for economic flourishment because it was going to be the same people being employed. And they wanted to put it, as you can see, less than a half a mile from George Washington High School and less than 0.3 miles of residential homes, which is a huge concern to all of us. And my sister actually goes to George Washington High School, and she does have asthma too. So here's a map of where General Iron was proposing to operate. Here's George Washington High School. This is our local park here. This is our local fresh market. Residential homes are located over here. Here's our river. And as you can see, there's a ton of companies already there. So what did the Stop General Iron campaign do? After 2.5 years, we actually stopped General Iron, but it wasn't easy. As you can see on the right-hand side, we hustled for a long time. I think we all started off by just saying enough was enough. A lot of us are third generation residents, so we saw our grandparents and our parents live through the same pollution. We connected with different youth in the neighborhood, different elderly folks, different residents, just uplifted their voices. We encouraged them to speak up. We were on social media quite heavily. We were also very, very adamant about pursuing the political parties that would be involved locally, statewide and nationally, as far as who would be responsible for something like this. And we relentlessly just went after them. We showed up to Lori Lightfoot's house twice. We told her we would come back if she didn't stop the permit, and we did. We showed up to our Wadi's house. People were unfortunately arrested outside of her house, but we did show up. We showed up to city council. I went down to Springfield at one point. We were outside of the Department of Public Health. Sorry, that's my 10-minute alarm. We were outside of the Chicago Department of Public Health, and we did petitions. We went to local school council meetings. We talked to the high school kids, but we were all grounded in scientific evidence as far as any advocacy that we were pushing towards basically getting the permit denied for the operations of General Iron. And we were also rooted in education as well. So these are just a couple of clips of different articles that we were featured in. Sorry. So this one I think I'm most proud of with Teen Vogue. 2 students led this article, Trinity Galone and Gregory Miller. They're current George Washington High School students, and we are featured in Teen Vogue. And then on the top left, you'll see that General Iron did have to pay a $500,000 fine before even operating in our neighborhood. So what that indicated to us was that regardless of whatever policies are in place currently or what would be pushed in the future, is that they were just not going to abide by it. Because if they're willing to pay $500,000 to operate again, then they're willing to violate another policy. And these are just a couple of pictures. And as you can see, represented in a lot of these photos, the youth were at the forefront. The youth were very vocal. I think my favorite one is at the bottom left, where we actually showed up to Alderwoman Garza's house, and she's the local representative for the 10th ward. And this was our victory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yesenia. I think that that is a great setup into our next speaker. So I'll just share my screen really quickly again. So next we have Aisha Kasi, who is a doctoral candidate in the Mathematics and Science Education PhD program here at UIC's Department of Curriculum and Instruction. Her prior degrees were also completed at UIC, where she got a BS in Biological Sciences in 2016 and an MED in Science Education in 2017. Aisha teaches AP Environmental Science and Honors Biology at a CPS school, where she also serves on the Culture and Climate Committee. In 2020, she was appointed to the position of Associate of Science and Education at the Field Museum and currently serves on its Science and Education, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Task Force. A co-founder and co-director of the Chicago Environmental Educators nonprofit organization, she supports a network of over 200 Chicago educators addressing environmental and climate injustices and redefining environmental education in partnership with community organizations. She's a contributing author of the 2020 to 2021 Environmental Literacy for Illinois Framework. She's a member of the Chicago Teachers Union, Climate Justice Committee, UIC Chancellor's Committee on Sustainability and Energy, and the Chicago Biodiversity Assessment Advisory Board. All right, so thank you very much, Aisha, and let's get started.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and this beautiful opportunity. Here, let's go in. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for this beautiful opportunity. I'm going to focus on environmental justice from an education perspective. And I think it's incredibly important to think about that the environmental justice movement is really centered and focused around this concept of horizontality, that we all have that power. We all are leaders in this movement. We all are bringing something that's absolutely important in this movement. If you don't have time and capacity to do some of the work that you think needs to be done, you are already doing this work by being there for community. So I think that's absolutely something to think of before we start talking about this work. I also like to ground and focus on ethics. So all living things have a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. And I'm purposely saying all living things and not just humans have a right to clean air, clean water, healthful environment, because we tend to focus from a very human-centered perspective. So it's absolutely important that when we think about who are we trying to fight for? We're fighting for ourselves and our community, but we're also fighting for all living things. Your pets deserve clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. The invasive species they deserve and they have the right to clean air, clean water, healthful environment. So we have to think about the rights of everything that is living. And so when we think about the collective, we have to realize there's power in community, and that diverse community has power in educating some of these important topics. We all have different ways of educating about this issue. And I want us to feel empowered to be able to share this information within the networks that we have influence in. People are influenced by each other constantly. So what you share contributes to the collective conscious of what we care about in the society. And so in my classes, when I talk about environmental justice work, I make sure with my students, my first unit in AP Environmental Science is to also connect this to the other justice movements. Environmental justice is also about health justice, mental health justice, educational justice, and social justice. So access to clean air, clean water, clean land, making sure that those environmental burdens aren't impacting the ways you navigate your communities, whether that commute is a little bit longer, whether you're worried about what's in your garden or in your water. Educational justice, being able to have access to this very important knowledge. Are you aware that there are homes in Chicago that have lead in their water? Why are we not all aware of this? How are we going to go about this? And then social justice, most importantly, your marginalized communities are on the front line. So how do you make sure that they are the ones front and center, being protected as we move forward? I like to bring up this perspective, the silo perspective, as someone who works in CPS, who teaches AP Environmental Science, someone who's a doctoral student studying environmental education, and someone who's at the museum working with scientists as an associate. People tend to look at these places as much as silos, and I have to check myself to remember that this is very interconnected. We have to come together and work together. When we work together, that work becomes very powerful. And so we need to look at this interconnected perspective of the primary schools, your K through 12, your colleges and universities that shape, that influence and shape the policies, that influence whatever the schools are going into, and the museums that are also engaging the same way, both impacting the colleges and universities and also impacting the ways we interact with educators and students. So I wrote EJ in the center because we can do this justice work if we find ways to connect with each other. And so when I think of Chicago Environmental Educators, the group myself and Yolanda, we co-founded, we wanted to find those connections. We wanted to find ways to work with local institutions, work with other organizations that are already existing doing this work to come together and try to educate our community, the public, and the public being everyone. And so again, this interconnected perspective, educators, youth, and community, everybody has an asset. Everybody has this privilege that they can tap into. And so educators, we have to be mindful of like what we are teaching. The youth bring that energy, that passion, that creativity, that care that we all need and that we all need to hear. So we have to find each other valuable in the community as well. We serve these communities as educators, so how are we giving back? And so Chicago Environmental Educators, again, myself and Yolanda, we hosted a bunch of kayak for conservation events, partnering with the Shed Aquarium, trying to create safe spaces for BIPOC, color individuals to feel safe kayaking and being on the water for the first time and trying to understand the work that is being done around the Chicago River. We've done cleanup events, which you can see on the side. And then the bottom right is like seeds that we got from my good friend, ecologist Isa Rudinsky, who gathers native seeds, sent them over to my school. My students are going to grow those prairie plants and then plant them eventually in our prairie. So they can see that work. It's not about waiting for this work. It's about doing that work now. So this slide looks pretty messy, but it's all tied to General Iron. And so Yesenia's beautiful work, Oscar's beautiful work in this community, Brianna's, Chuck, I can keep naming so many people in the General Iron campaign that inspired me as an ally, as someone who is not living on the Southeast side, to use my skills to try to educate the public what is going on here. And so I started to create these digital squares. I made this on Canva. I used an iPad and an Apple Pencil, and I just started like sketching this away. And then I started posting this on a weekly basis to try to engage the public using my skills to make sure that I can help this greater effort. And so this was absolutely important way to also show an example to my students that, you know, I don't have to be in that community to help. We are just as powerful as being there and just making sure that this is something everyone is aware of. And that's really coming down is like bringing that education. What's really cool is, and the most important moment of this campaign was when my students created this sketch. I did not ask for this. My student created this over the weekend, and they ended up creating this poster, and they reached out to me wanting to connect with students at George Washington High School. And so for me, that was my highlight moment in my teaching career ever, where students on their own felt empowered to create artwork for a community that they don't live in. And they engage in this conversation with students there. They felt empowered to do that. And this is something I will always cherish forever, is that students felt that they just felt like they could do this and they didn't have to wait. They didn't have to graduate high school to do this work. For anyone who's starting this work, a couple things to think about is that when this information can be overwhelming and you don't know where to start. I advise starting from our history, starting place-based, and Chicago's history is so rich. So I really recommend looking into Hazel Johnson and the work that she has done. She's the mother of the environmental justice movement. She's a Chicagoan. She coined the toxic donut. Please take a look at her work. That's a great place to start. I also recommend connecting with your neighbors. Understand where the libraries are, where are the museums, where are the parks, where are the schools. You can do it in a community community asset mapping activity where you have students understand all the resources that are there and then asking students, what are we missing? Let's compare our neighborhood to the neighborhood next door or the neighborhood on the north side and then on the south side. How can we make this place a better space? I also recommend looking at environmental reports. These are great. They get published weekly, quarterly, some yearly, and this provides that raw scientific data for students to look at and then start to understand that this work is constantly being done, a lot that we can be doing. I also recommend looking at digital maps. So just like Yesenia was showing, this is the map I showed my students before I talked about General Iron, where it was like, let's take a look at what's going on here. Let's talk about this. That's really it. It was a simple prompt, but it definitely started that conversation. Oops. I also recommend, sorry, and skipped over, it's okay. So I also recommend scientific articles. Published research is great. This is where having an ally in academia is absolutely important. Some of this research is not accessible to the public. So important to kind of tap into that, bring that into the classroom so students can see it. Academic Twitter is great. It's open, it's free, it's out there. Got some great articles from folks that are doing this beautiful work. I'm gonna try to wrap this up here. Here are just pictures of us at this General Iron protest community event spaces. It's really powerful to just be present if you can, if you have that privilege, if you know someone in community that can be there. So I wanted to quickly just show you some images, just the size, the scope, the feeling, and all types of weather in the rain, and it's wet and it's cold, and you're out there and you're listening, and then you can share that in these spaces. I also just quickly want to share that, you know, all of us have come together in different spaces to create different frameworks. This is one framework where there's 30 different people from 30 different organizations coming together to try to push something forward. And I appreciate when institutions take the time to create something like this. This took like about 1.5 years, 2 years to actually construct. And it's something you can be proud of. I also appreciate spaces that let people teach about this. And so this is something I wanted to share. Last thing I want to share is from the CTU Climate Justice Committee. We are trying to address how the public pension fund is basically hurting public land. And so the sign that I'm holding in the center is $602 million of our Chicago Teachers Pension Fund funds fossil fuels, and we need to divest. That's a lot of money. So again, there's like different spaces we can be doing this work and where we can be pushing this work. And so I just want to end by saying, you have the skills that will help this environmental justice effort. And we can make the world a better place. You got this, I got this, we got this. And we are going to make this space much better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aisha. And let me share my screen one last time. Our final panelist for this evening is Cyatharine Alias. She has been a member of Chicago Asian Americans for Environmental Justice since the start of the pandemic. As a part of CAAEG, she has helped with food distribution with Neighbors for Environmental Justice, facilitating the book club, and facilitating monthly meetings with our members. Outside of CAAEG, she works at Center for Neighborhood Technology as a manager of community infrastructure and resilience. Cyatharine, thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. And want to thank Yesenia and Aisha for doing a lot of the introduction on environmental justice, environmental racism. So hopefully you all have like grounded some of that in your brain. I know it's been a lot of information. I really appreciate the two of them for taking lead on the panel before I went on. So I'm Cyatharine Alias. I represent Chicago Asian Americans for Environmental Justice, or also known as CAGE. And I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, thinking about environmental justice from an identity perspective, not just a place space, because of the nature of our organization. And oftentimes you'll hear about environmental justice in a very place-based space. And so just wanted to share some ideas and thoughts there. So first is so we're Chicago Asian Americans for Environmental Justice. We represent Asian communities, and specifically want to say Asian American communities because Pacific Islander communities might have a different relationship with the environment because of their indigenous roots. So just want to be really clear about language there before I start. But like many other minoritized communities, Asian communities have a higher exposure to toxic pollutants. So kind of to what Yesenia had pointed out, we're also minoritized communities in the US are exposed to more air pollution than than white people. And for example, we experience more nitrogen dioxide, which comes from tailpipes. And part of that is because of land use policies. I'm an urban planner by training, and we have all heard of redlining and how redlining made some areas like, in the red zone. And so they got lower land prices. And because of that, industry was able to move in. And the reason why they got the lower land prices is because there were already Black people there or immigrants. And so there's already this really huge tie between people of color and then being valued as less, and therefore industry moves in, which is what happened with the Southeast side, and why General Iron thought they could move over there. So talking specifically about Asian American communities, if you think about Chinatown in Chicago, for example, highways bisect Chinatown. So it's a community that's near a lot of air pollution. This is true throughout the US and with other communities of color. Additionally, segregation in itself has a correlation with exposure to different air toxics and therefore devastating health consequences. So in this chart, you can see that we have different races that have been, and racial demographics that have been, ethnicities that have been shown. And so if you have less segregation, there's usually a less risk of air toxics and then therefore less like lifetime risk. But as segregation increases, because again of industrial land use policies from history and as it continues on to this present day, segregated communities are often most likely to face different air toxics and therefore health concerns. And this is true amongst all minoritized groups, more so than those who are non-Hispanic white. And then there's also this aspect of class. So Asian Americans, we represent a huge continent representing many different people. And as many might know, rarely is our data disaggregated. And so everyone sees Asian Americans as the model minority, as making all this money, they're fine. But that's not the whole story of Asian Americans, because we've all immigrated to the US at different points in time with different financial abilities. And so we have different incomes, which then impact where we can live in the US. And so again, like I was saying, land use values, real estate values impact where you can live. And then that means also because of land use policies in terms of industry or highways being close to that, those like unwanted uses, some communities are closer to air toxins or water pollution, et cetera. And so it's really important to think about race and class when it comes to environmental injustice. And so it's really also important to think about the ways that some communities might be invisible because of the mainstream media, talking specifically only about like the model minority or talking just about Black and brown communities, which do like rightfully so, but missing out like sometimes on Asian communities or other communities like Indigenous folks who are also facing a lot of environmental racism and environmental injustice. Okay, so we got environmental justice. We know that there's a problem. There's also a problem when it comes to climate change. So we all know that climate change is happening, it's coming, and it's impacting areas differently. This map shows with like the different brands of red, what areas are becoming less suitable for humans based on like where we've lived. And you can see most of it is happening kind of like in the tropics and a little bit south, mostly because as the climate warms up, the warm places are going to get way warmer and therefore not fit in with where we are as humans right now. Another huge thing is thinking about Asia. We have this area where 4 billion people live. China and India have the largest populations in the world. And you can see the amount of red that's happening in that space. It's really going to impact people who live in Asia. So like my family who lives back in India and others who have family in the area. And so that's just really something important to think about. So from the identity perspective, we are impacted by environmental injustice here in the US, and also by environmental justice and climate injustice elsewhere. And so it's having this both local and global perspective of what is happening with the environment and what's happening with climate. And really important point is, you know, a lot of Asian countries, as in addition to African countries and Latin American countries, are considered developing countries. And that's because we've been pillaged from. Like, we know Europeans and the US itself has gone in and taken our resources and continues to dump a lot of the trash from our uses of climate or our uses of products, etc. And so it's really important to recognize that challenging the dominant narrative that Asian countries, Latin American countries, and African countries are developing, we were pillaged. And so really framing in that way, understanding who is told to be responsible for climate change, who is told to be responsible for environmental injustice, but who actually caused that, and how do we push them to make sure that those countries, nations, powers, corporate beings are actually taking the action to undo the harms that have been done to us as people. And so this really means there are different steps that we can take to kind of piggyback on what Ayesha has said and what Yesenia has shared. It's we need to be connected in our local communities, especially across, in our places, across different racial lines, class lines, etc., because all of these communities are dealing with this bigger systemic issue in how it's showing up in their space. And so we need to join organizations as individuals to be able to use our individual action force in group and solidarity action. Another way is to support movements nationally and abroad, because environmental justice does not just happen in Chicago. It doesn't just happen in the United States. It happens globally, and we're part of this whole system. And so, yes, pay attention to what's happening locally, but don't forget that things are happening globally, that we have solidarity. We can have power more together once we see the connections between all areas. Incorporate environmental justice into organizations you're part of. Aisha is a great example of this, about how Aisha did that with CPS and in her work as an environmental science teacher. And learn your languages. So this is, as a group, many of us are either immigrants or children of immigrants, or a couple of generations down of immigrants. And it's so important to learn our languages so that we can connect back up to those who don't speak English, so that they are aware of the issue, so that we can keep them informed and gather power. Our power cannot just be in English. Our power has to be across languages, across different cultures, so that, because corporations are telling us English is the only way, capitalism is the only way, and that's not true. There are so many other options, but it is on us in this new, as this next generation and the generations that come after us, to make sure that we stay connected and don't ostracize or isolate groups just because they don't fit this dominant narrative of what to be. And so what are we doing at CAGE right now? So CAGE kind of started with the Chinatown Environmental Justice Initiative, where we were looking at lead in soil, because Chinatown used to be an industrial area, and a lot of residents in Chinatown, McKinley Park, do gardening as a way to have food for themselves, to have culturally relevant food. And since then, we've kind of spanned out. And in our meetings, we talk about the personal. We talk about how we are connected to the environmental world around us, because it's not just about humans, it's about all beings. We also strive to make sure that things are approachable. It's super hard. Yesenia went through all of this science. It can be really hard, but what Aisha mentioned, Hazel Johnson didn't have an environmental background. So it's part of our role in these organizations to be helping others, and especially for you all who are getting your graduate degrees, to be able to communicate the information in a way that anyone can approach it in a way that makes sense to them, because they are still living their lived experience. Their lived experience matters just as much as any quantitative data point. And so helping make those connections is really important. And that's kind of what our base at CAGE is really helping people make the connections, developing the analysis so that we can push against the corporate powers, the various people with all of the money and all of the privilege, against that narrative, so that we can create a more powerful movement. And just wanted to share some information about Cage, and wanted to open up for questions, I think, but I'll hand it back to Zoe.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you. So now we're just going to get into some of our panel questions. Just give me 1 minute while I fumble with Zoom to make sure that everybody is spotlighted. So the first question that I have for all of you is, you all kind of mentioned how you collaborate in one way or another to support your EJ causes. Can you talk more about how that came about and why these relationships are important to your work? Yesenia, I don't know if you want to start because you kind of, started at the beginning, but don't feel any pressure.
Oh, no worries. I can start off. I think it started with the kids, honestly. I was really passionate about making sure that the generation that's coming right behind me knows what I know, and they're going to be able. I wanted to make sure that they didn't have to fight the fight that I'm fighting right now. Like, I wanted to battle because I didn't want my sister to have to deal with this in her future. And the fact that General Iron was going to be literally right across the street from the school and at the point where they can see the building, it was really important for me in the Stop General Iron campaign for them to understand what their environment is, what their external environment is, how it's affecting them, how it can affect their mental health, especially in a respiratory pandemic. A lot of our residents didn't understand what was going on. So targeting schools, targeting different organizations, targeting churches, targeting local school council meetings was the best approach for us to just get the word out. And that's how I got introduced to Aisha, was through the George Washington High School community, because a couple CTU members and teachers from George Washington were mutual friends. And that's how we got introduced. And then we just connected, realized she was a teacher. And I think sometime in May, I'm supposed to be joining her class and speaking with her students. So that's how we got connected with the environmental justice movement.
Do you want to go next, Aisha, just because, they're going to be talking.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think Yesenia said it so beautifully. And I would just say, just being active in community is so important. I know it's easy to be focused on your own work and your own progress and your own success, but just listening, and then through the grapevine, you hear, hey, there's folks doing a protest against General Iron. You're like, who's General Iron? And then it's like, wait, I kind of heard that in Lincoln Park. Whoa, let's connect this. Let's reach out to my friend. Like, you live there. Do you know about this? And again, through mutual friends, it came through the grapevine, and knowing the people there and just being there present and creating those relationships, then you truly start to care for the people there. If you care about human health, then you're going to really care about these issues. So you have to remind yourself that every time you move forward, is that this is for human health, no matter how hard it is.
I just have to add, I think it helps to think about personally how the environment has been supportive to you, or how you wish the environment outside was supportive to you. When I was growing up, my dad had the privilege of switching jobs because he developed workplace asthma. If he hadn't been able to switch jobs, he would have had continued asthma, and that would really impacted his life and how he was able to care for our family. My mom had breast cancer growing up. We were able to go walk outside every day, and that was so important to her health, and that helped inculcate how important the environment was for me and helping my family. And because of that, I'm really aware of that when I go to different places and when I move to different communities over the times that I have. So I think it's super important to think about things that might seem really simple in some places aren't that easy because of all this history. And so trying to find connections with community is probably the most important way. And it's important to understand, you shouldn't be joining community just because you feel guilty. That isn't the point of it. There is a deep connection of you as an individual to this earth, and this earth as a huge organism to the rest of the humans, and therefore you are connected to other humans. And so that's really, really important.
Thank you all so much. So the next question we have is, are there any roadblocks that your EJ organization is currently facing? And specifically from the chat, somebody was wondering if you're having any challenges collaborating with some of these people who might not have an EJ focus, you know, schools, higher education, museums. I don't know if anyone in particular wants to start, but I'll leave the floor open.
I can jump on this question because I know someone was directly asking me that too. I think one thing, navigating 3 different spaces, both CPS, UIC, and Field Museum, what grounds the work that we do, I don't like to say I do because it's we, is why are we doing this? And that helps clear out why people are invested in this work, especially if you're not from community. If you're not from that community, why are you there? And how do you check yourself to make sure that you are not on the front line, but someone from that community is? Because it's like, I think that's one thing, is to be mindful of like when it's appropriate to be leading and when is it appropriate to let someone from that community to be actually leading. And so that's a dance. It's an intricate dance, and you learn that through experience, and I've learned that through experience. And I'm not saying I'm no expert. I'm still learning. And I think just hearing about native languages, I think that's so beautiful, because in that earlier presentation, that stuff, that's the step we all should be taking, is like, how do we communicate in ways that are collaborative and not just this one very centric way of communicating this info.
I saw a lot of nods from you, Catherine. Do you want to go next?
I think for us, because we're, like, Cage membership right now is kind of disparate across Chicago, it is hard in terms of like organizing. I think really having a place base is helpful. Really getting to know your neighbors is helpful, and like being able to have that language ability is super important. And so I think those are some of the challenges that we are going as a newer organization that's more disparate across Chicago, but wanting to make sure that we're serving Asian Americans in the Chicagoland area. So that's something that we're thinking about, like, how do we connect with, you know, groups that are directly servicing those communities, and how are we making sure we have translators? How are we making sure that we ourselves, for those of us who have some language like ability in our native tongues, like how do we feel comfortable in explaining these really complex things, right? Like having confidence in making mistakes in the process. Like it's okay that someone is not a professional translator, definitely get support, but don't think that there is any power. So I think that those are some of the things that we're working through at Cage, but I want to hand it over to Yesenia too.
Thanks, Catherine. We can definitely relate as far as the translation goes. There was a lot of material that we put out into the community and just in the city that wasn't translated in Spanish. So that was a huge area of opportunity for us. But I think our biggest roadblock, honestly, was the democratic process and our local representatives. Our local representative was absent the entire time. And when Alderwoman Garza did pop up, it was in opposition to what we were doing. And she made it very clear to the media. So I think once we realized that she wasn't on the side of her constituents, we had a decision to make, right? We would either keep pursuing Alderwoman Garza and trying to get her support and trying to convince her as to why this issue was so important to her constituents, the people that literally voted her into office, or we can keep moving and let her dig her own hole and let her create her own legacy. And if this is what she wants to stand on, then that was her own decision. So we kept moving forward. We also had a difficult time advocating for translators, just for the town halls that the city was putting on for the different presentations that they had regarding general iron and what their process was that they were following in order to make a decision regarding the general iron permit. And you would think with a community like the East Side that's over 50% Latina population, that would be a no-brainer to have a translator on board for a town hall, but it was a struggle. So I can definitely relate to some of the things that Catherine and Aisha mentioned as far as roadblocks. But for the most part, like Catherine said, you know, you get comfortable with, not comfortable, but you acknowledge your mistakes, you learn from them, and, you know, failure only really happens when you give up. So as long as you make errors and learn from them, that's the best you can do, and you just got to keep it pushing.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, I can definitely relate to the language piece of it. I mean, when you don't have language that people can understand, whether it's, you know, their native language or just, you know, making sure that they can read it, it's systematically keeping people out of the equation, and it's totally on purpose. So thank you all for sharing that. So the next question we have is, a lot of people are asking are what are some tangible actions and strategies that people can take on right now to support EJ? I think Catherine put it really well. Like, these are problems that are happening right now. We don't want to fix, we want it fixed right now. And I think a lot of people here want to fix it right now. So whether it's the graduate students, community members, and then I think you all talked about how this is a really kind of youth-led and centered kind of approach. So the youth as well. So what are some actions that people can take? Do you want to start, Catherine?
I'm going to resonate with what the three of us have been saying in all of our presentations. Connect to your community, right? Like, you either live in a place, you work in a place, you play in a place. Like, you are in a place at any point in time. Find out what are the issues there and try to get connected. It can be especially hard if you live in a community that doesn't have like an organizing infrastructure yet. And that is very much the case if you live in the suburbs. Like, there are still areas of the suburbs that are disinvested in and face environmental justice issues, but it's really about developing those connections. And like, relationship building is like the most critical component that like anyone can do, either so that you can learn more, get to know people more, and like figure out what are the issues, because people might be just going through their lives and saying like, oh, this is just what my life is. And that's okay, but it's not, because there are issues, right? And so, but that isn't understood as an issue until you're seeing it happen with other folks. And so I think that's probably the number one first thing to do. And then if you are in a place that has like an organizational infrastructure, get connected to those orgs.
Great. Yesenia, do you want to go next?
These are such loaded questions because there's so much that you can do with environmental justice. I think start by reflecting on what your passions are. I think everybody has a skill set, everybody has a passion, and things are more organically executed when you love what you do. Because it's a really tough field to go into, and it's very emotionally charged, and you have to remain grounded in what your passions are and in your mental health. So I would say reflect on what your passions are, reflect on what your privileges are, what you're good at, how you would like to contribute, and then, go online, search for different organizations in Chicago, look in your community and see who's already started the work, so you don't have to turn the wheels if they're already started. And just connect with your neighbors. I think that was one huge advantage that we had on the Southeast side, because a lot of us have grown up with each other. A lot of our parents have grown up with each other. They went to high school with each other. A lot of our grandparents worked with each other in the different factories that are around the area. So we were all quite connected in different ways. And we learned how we were connected as well through the Stop Gender Iron campaign. And the way that we're discriminated against resonates differently when you have a personal connection with your neighbors, because you feel it in the heart when you, like, I don't know if you guys remember the picture that was in my presentation, but the gentleman that had the Stop Gender Iron sign that was literally connected to an oxygen tank reminded me of my papo that also had, to have oxygen plugged into him, and he also lived on the Southeast side. And the kids that I was working with from George Washington High School reminded me of my sister. She wasn't on the front lines, and it's not that I wanted her to, but they're the same age, same generation, same school. So connecting with your neighbors is huge. Think about your passions, your skill set, how your privileges can be beneficial for other communities that might not have the same privileges, or people that are just from different circumstances, and just pace yourself. It's a long road. Success is always tangible, but patience is a huge thing with environmental justice.
Anything else to add, Aisha?
Yeah, I would just add one more thing, and it's just like asking people what they need. I think we're so quick at sharing what we need at times, and this is myself including, like, I need this, I need that, but it's just being like listening and asking, what do you all need? How can I help you? Or how can we help? And sometimes that help is like, can you flyer this around the neighborhood? Can you deliver groceries to X, Y, and Z? You can't get groceries. And those little things are making a difference. And so I think we need to start getting used to asking what are your needs and how can we help to fulfill those needs?
Great, thank you all. I am cognizant of time, so if there's anybody in the audience who wants to ask a live question, feel free to raise your hand now. I will give it a second. But while we wait, I just want to thank you all again. This has been really great, and I really appreciate you all being here today. I don't see any hands, so the last question I will end on is unfortunately another loaded one, but I think it's an important one. So what do you think the future of environmental justice might look like in the city of Chicago? I mean, obviously, we just want to, breathe clean air and drink clean water, but, what do you think, what do you hope the future of EJ will look like?
I'll jump on this one right away. I'll say it is youth-led, diversity's there, all neighborhoods are represented, and youth are taken seriously at the table. And so are elders in the community and those who are like on the front line that don't have time. So I'm like an envision of many different councils and ways of engagement that are seriously taken.
Catherine or Yesenia, you want to jump in?
I'll let Yesenia go first.
Dang, I was hoping you went before me. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the future. We're currently working on some different policies to put in place to make sure something like General Iron doesn't happen again on the Southeast side. But things like that take time. I think the future of environmental justice will only be sustainable with education. It's a multi-generational campaign. It's a multi-generational movement, and staying connected with the different generations is going to be the best option moving forward. Uplifting voices that aren't usually at the forefront. So people that are white passing, like myself, even though I'm a Latina, I'm clearly white passing. Sometimes I'm, gonna need to shut up and put people that aren't on the forefront, give them a platform, let them speak, let them take their narrative, let them speak to their own experiences and uplift them, to flourish as environmental justice advocates in whichever way seems best for them. But like Aisha said, I think working with youth has been extremely beneficial, and is also going to be very sustainable for the future too, because the more they're empowered, the more they're educated, the more confident they're going to feel within themselves to stand their ground, demand better, and ultimately, if you know better, you do better.
I think for me, like two things are, one, learning from like globally on how EJ movements are going. There's so much to learn there, and so much of academia is so Western focused, and we forget how many brilliant ideas and thoughtful connections there are in the global South. So that's one thing. And then two, really challenging what work means. What does productivity look like? What does our economy look like? The reason why we treat our environment so bad is because we think our economy needs to work one certain way, that the Southeast only deserves jobs that are just industrial and not like healthy jobs, or like things that like it's either jobs or the environment, and that's not the case.
Yes, I absolutely agree. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago that I did on Indigenous health, and people were kind of asking, like, what is land back? Like, what does land back mean? And I was like, when you give the land back to the Indigenous people, it's not work. It's just people taking care of the environment. So I really appreciate all of your answers. And yeah, definitely, Catherine, it doesn't have to be one or the other. We can have both of them. So I will give my thanks to all of you one more time. Like I said, this was so informative. This was a really great discussion. It was great to see how all of you are collaborating and will continue to collaborate. I know that people got some really great tangible strategies, and hopefully they will reach out to you so they can continue to fight the good fight. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a great week.